June 5, 1944. 2300 hours. Somewhere above the English Channel, the roar of C-47 engines filled the night sky as hundreds of transport aircraft carried men of the 101st Airborne Division toward occupied France. Among them, young paratroopers of the Screaming Eagles checked their weapons, tightened their harnesses, and stared into the darkness, knowing that within minutes they would be plunging into history. German commanders along the Norman coast believed their communications network of telephone lines, dispatch riders, and radio posts was secure enough to withstand any attempt at disruption. They had spent months fortifying beaches, emplacing artillery, and reinforcing coastal strongpoints. What they had not anticipated was that an entire American airborne division would descend silently behind their lines, striking not at bunkers or beaches, but at the very arteries of German command and control. The plan was brutally simple: land in the dead of night, sever telephone lines, seize key crossroads, and deny German reserves the ability to move or communicate. By dawn, the beaches would be assaulted from the front, while inland chaos paralyzed any coordinated response. For German commanders expecting a conventional invasion, this was a nightmare they had never properly prepared to face. When the first jump lights flicked from red to green, stick after stick of paratroopers hurled themselves into the slipstream. The night exploded with silk canopies opening, the muffled thuds of equipment bundles hitting fields, and the whispered curses of men scattered by heavy flak and erratic navigation. The landings were chaotic, with many units dropping miles from their intended zones. Yet this chaos became a weapon. German headquarters could not determine where the main threat lay. Reports of parachutes sighted in multiple villages, gunfire erupting near hedgerows, and demolition charges detonating on bridges convinced commanders that an entire army was descending upon them. In reality, fewer than 13,000 paratroopers were on the ground, many isolated in small groups, but every one of them carried the mission to cut communications wherever they landed. Private Joseph Barrel, who would later be captured and escape multiple times, recalled hitting the ground near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. He and two other paratroopers located a cluster of German field telephone lines strung along wooden poles. Using wire cutters carried specifically for this purpose, they severed the lines in several places, wrapping the ends around tree branches to make quick repair impossible. By 0000 hours, the battalion command post they had targeted was cut off from divisional headquarters. Similar stories unfolded across Normandy. In dozens of villages, scattered groups of Americans destroyed switchboards, ambushed dispatch riders, and blasted bridges with gammon bombs. Every action, however small, multiplied into operational paralysis for the Germans. Major Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heide, a veteran Fallschirmjäger officer, later admitted during interrogation that the Americans' dispersion, which German intelligence initially believed to be a catastrophic error, created an illusion of overwhelming strength. Reports flooded corps headquarters of paratroopers everywhere, near Carentan, Saint-Côme-du-Mont, Sainte-Mère-Église, and countless hamlets in between. Radio operators begged for clarification, but higher headquarters themselves were cut off by severed cables and jammed frequencies. The confusion paralyzed decision-making. Reserves that might have counterattacked the beaches were held back to deal with phantom airborne threats that never materialized. By 2000 hours, organized elements of the 502nd and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments began to consolidate. Their objectives included key road junctions such as Causeway No. 2 leading inland from Utah Beach. Without these choke points, German armored reinforcements could not reach the coast. At Le Port, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole gathered scattered men and launched an immediate assault on a German outpost guarding the causeway. With bayonets fixed and grenades primed, his paratroopers stormed the position in the darkness, silencing machine guns and capturing prisoners. The road was cut, and demolition teams placed explosives on nearby culverts, ensuring that even if the enemy attempted repairs, delays would cost precious hours. German commanders expecting to issue rapid counterattack orders instead discovered their orders could not even reach frontline units. The role of silence cannot be overstated. Unlike conventional infantry divisions, the paratroopers relied on speed, stealth, and shock. Many carried special clicker devices, crickets, to identify each other in the dark. To German sentries, the faint metallic clicks followed by sudden bursts of automatic fire created terror and confusion. At Sainte-Mère-Église, one of the first towns liberated in occupied France, paratroopers of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment engaged German defenders in street fighting illuminated by burning buildings. By 4:30, the Americans controlled the town square and had established a defensive perimeter. More importantly, they seized the local telephone exchange, cutting yet another vital node in the German communication network. By the time beach assaults began at dawn, German higher command had only fragments of information, much of it outdated, contradictory, or completely false. In some sectors, German units attempted to restore lines of communication. Dispatch riders mounted on motorcycles tried to navigate hedgerow-lined lanes, only to be ambushed by small groups of paratroopers lying in wait. Corporal Bill Tucker recalled setting up an ambush near a crossroads with two fellow soldiers. They heard the whine of an approaching motorcycle, opened fire with their M1 Garrisons, and left the messenger dead on the road. On his body were orders directing a nearby reserve battalion to counterattack toward Utah Beach. The orders never arrived. That single ambush, one of dozens that night, ensured American assault troops landing on the beaches would face scattered resistance rather than concentrated divisions. The Germans had invested heavily in fortified strongpoints, bunkers armed with machine guns, and artillery batteries dug into concrete casemates. Yet all of these relied on coordination. A battery isolated from its headquarters could not know where to shift fire. Infantry cut off from orders hesitated to move. By dawn on June 6th, entire sectors of the German defense network were reduced to silence. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Falle, commander of the 91st Infantry Division, attempted to drive from his headquarters to coordinate defenses. His staff car was ambushed by paratroopers near Sainte-Mère-Église, and he was killed in the firefight. With his death, one of the key German divisions opposing the invasion lost its commander at the critical moment. The Screaming Eagles had not only severed communications lines, but physically decapitated enemy leadership. By morning, the extent of the disruption was evident at German 7th Army headquarters in Le Mans. Fragmentary reports painted a picture of massive airborne landings stretching from Cherbourg to Caen. With telephone lines down, couriers missing, and radios jammed or destroyed, commanders could not verify the situation. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, away in Germany for his wife's birthday, was unable to return immediately, and his subordinates hesitated to release armored reserves without direct authorization. The result was paralysis. Hours passed while American forces poured onto the beaches unopposed by the kind of concentrated counterattack that German doctrine prescribed. Those hours, bought by paratroopers with wire cutters, demolition charges, and rifles, changed the outcome of the invasion. Veterans of the 101st would later describe the night as the longest of their lives. Many fought in isolated skirmishes, sometimes believing themselves the only survivors of their stick. Yet collectively, their actions shredded the German communications web. Historian Stephen Ambrose later summarized it simply: the paratroopers turned the German defense into a series of disconnected outposts, each blind and deaf, each fighting alone. For German commanders who believed their telephone and courier network was robust, the sudden silence was devastating. They had never expected American paratroopers to land in such numbers, at such depth, and with such precision in targeting communications. By 1200 hours on June 6th, Utah Beach was secure. Casualties were lighter than expected, in part because German reserves never arrived in strength. The causeways inland were in American hands, the towns controlling road junctions were held by airborne troops, and German headquarters were still struggling to re-establish contact with their units. The Screaming Eagles had achieved their mission. With knives, grenades, and silence, they had cut the cords binding German defenses together. The bridges and roads would matter in the days to come, but on that first night, it was the wires, poles, and radios destroyed by paratroopers that determined success. German commanders never expected their carefully constructed communications to collapse so completely in a matter of hours. Yet that is exactly what happened in the darkness of June 6, 1944, when the Screaming Eagles came from the sky. June 6, 1944. In the darkness before dawn, scattered German garrisons across Normandy were roused from uneasy sleep by the first sharp cracks of distant gunfire. At first, many assumed it was routine harassment by Allied bombers or local partisan sabotage. But as the minutes passed, the sounds grew nearer, punctuated by the unmistakable thump of demolition charges detonating at bridges and crossroads. For the men in isolated strongpoints, the night had suddenly become alive with confusion, and within hours it would erupt into chaos that none of their officers had anticipated. What confronted them was not the slow, grinding infantry assault they had trained to repel, but a series of sudden, violent ambushes executed by American paratroopers who seemed to materialize from the hedgerows themselves. The German defensive system in Normandy had been designed to fight a linear battle. Each garrison, whether a platoon-sized outpost in a village or a company holding a coastal battery, relied on coordination with neighboring units and rapid reinforcement from reserves. The expectation was clear: hold long enough for counterattacks to assemble. Yet on D-Day morning, that chain of support disintegrated. German soldiers who had been briefed that the beaches would be the decisive battlefield now found the war erupting in their rear areas. Telephone lines were dead, couriers failed to arrive, and the first vehicles attempting to move along country roads were met not by friendly guides, but by carefully laid American ambushes. At Oro van 30 hours, near the village of Ravenneauville, a German garrison of 60 men heard explosions along the highway. A section of their roadblock had been destroyed by gammon bombs. When they rushed to investigate, they walked directly into a line of paratroopers lying prone along the ditches. The Americans opened fire with M1 Garand and Browning automatic rifles, cutting down the lead squads. Grenades exploded among the trucks that followed, igniting fuel tanks and throwing debris into the night sky. Survivors scattered into the hedgerows, pursued by short bursts from Thompson submachine guns. Within minutes, the road was littered with burning vehicles and dead soldiers. The Americans melted back into the darkness, leaving the stunned survivors to stumble back to their post, unable to comprehend how so small a group could inflict such devastation. This pattern repeated itself across the Cotentin Peninsula. German strongpoints reported sudden bursts of fire at crossroads, the detonation of bridges just after convoys approached, and the disappearance of patrols sent to investigate. At Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, a company of paratroopers ambushed a German column moving toward the beach exits. Hidden behind thick hedgerows, they waited until the lead vehicles were well inside the kill zone. A whistle blew, and the night exploded with bazooka rounds, machine gun bursts, and rifle fire. The first trucks were knocked out, blocking the road, while the rear vehicles were hit by mortar fire. Trapped between wrecks, German infantry attempted to deploy but were cut down by overlapping fields of fire. In less than 15 minutes, the column ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Survivors crawled into ditches, too terrified to move. By dawn, that road, one of the few leading directly to Utah Beach, was effectively closed. What shocked the German garrisons most was the tempo of the attacks. They were used to set-piece battles, where artillery prepared the way and infantry moved methodically. Instead, they faced small, mobile groups of Americans who struck suddenly, inflicted casualties, and vanished before a counterattack could be organized. A sergeant of the 709th Infantry Division later recalled that it felt less like a conventional battle and more like being hunted. "We never knew where they were," he told interrogators. A patrol would leave the village and within minutes we would hear explosions. Sometimes none came back, sometimes only one. We could not move, and we could not call for help. It was as if ghosts fought us. Part of the shock came from the use of explosives. American paratroopers carried concentrated charges designed specifically for sabotage. Gammon grenades, simple cloth bags filled with high explosives, could be hurled against vehicles, bunkers, or bridges. TNT satchel charges brought down telephone poles and culverts. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, the sound of these blasts rolled for miles, convincing German defenders that massive attacks were underway. In reality, it was often just a squad of paratroopers cutting a single line or disabling a single culvert. Yet the psychological effect was out of proportion to the physical damage. Each explosion signaled to isolated German soldiers that their communications and supply routes were vanishing one after another. By 0300 hours, German reports described enemy raiding parties everywhere. In Carentan, garrison officers attempted to dispatch reinforcements north toward Sainte-Mère-Église. The convoy was ambushed twice in less than a mile, first by riflemen firing from orchards, then by demolition teams blowing culverts after the vehicles had crossed. By dawn, the reinforcements were stalled, trapped among wreckage, and cut off from further orders. In the village itself, soldiers huddled in cellars, listening to sporadic gunfire outside the walls. They had expected to march toward the beaches to repel an amphibious landing. Instead, they were prisoners inside their own garrison, stunned by the sudden violence erupting all around them. At Sainte-Mère-Église, the garrison experienced the most famous shock of all. In the early hours, parachutes filled the sky above the town. Some paratroopers landed directly in the square, illuminated by fires, started when anti-aircraft tracers ignited buildings. German defenders, roused from their billets, rushed into the streets only to be confronted by Americans firing from doorways, hedges, and even from behind stone walls barely meters away. The chaos was complete. Bells rang, civilians shouted, and in the confusion, many Germans believed the entire town had been surrounded by thousands of paratroopers. In reality, only a few hundred had landed nearby, many scattered and disorganized. But their aggressiveness created the impression of overwhelming force. By Euro 4:30, the Germans had abandoned the square, stunned at how quickly control had slipped from their hands. Another critical factor was the use of ambush against German reinforcements moving at night. German doctrines stressed rapid counterattack, but this required movement along narrow Norman roads. These became death traps. American squads dug in at key crossroads, waited for the sound of engines, then unleashed a storm of fire at point-blank range. Mortar teams pre-registered likely approaches and rained down shells as convoys halted. A single bazooka could disable the lead vehicle, blocking the road, after which riflemen and machine gunners cut down the trapped infantry. Survivors described the experience as terrifying darkness, hedgerows hiding invisible enemies, and sudden explosions that turned a march into a massacre. For soldiers trained to fight from fortified bunkers with clear lines of fire, this kind of unseen opponent was overwhelming. German officers attempted to restore order, but their own communications were collapsing. A lieutenant from the 91st Division rode forward on a motorcycle carrying orders. He was struck by fire from a roadside hedge and killed instantly. His dispatch never reached its destination. Similar incidents multiplied across the peninsula. By dawn, entire battalions had received no orders for hours. Company commanders in villages reported hearing explosions in every direction, but could not determine whether they faced isolated raiders or entire divisions. Many chose to dig in and wait, unwilling to risk marching into what seemed like certain ambush. This hesitation gave the Allies time to land unopposed on the beaches. For the Germans, the most stunning realization came at first light. From their garrison positions, they expected to see orderly columns of their own reserves marching to reinforce them. Instead, smoke rose from wrecked convoys, silence hung over telephone lines, and nervous survivors whispered of American ambushes lurking behind every hedgerow. In several places, soldiers simply refused to leave their strongpoints. A report captured after the battle described one battalion that remained in defensive positions until noon, having no orders and believing the entire area to be infested with paratroopers. When they finally ventured out, they discovered wreckage on the roads and abandoned vehicles, evidence of the devastating ambushes that had paralyzed their comrades. The scale of German confusion is revealed in post-war testimony. General Wilhelm Fally's staff described repeated attempts to muster counterattacks that dissolved within miles of leaving their bases. Platoons dispatched to clear roadblocks never returned. Columns of vehicles reported being attacked by mortars and bazookas within minutes of departure. Entire companies vanished into the bocage, their fate unknown until after the war. What paratroopers had achieved with small unit ambushes was strategic paralysis across the entire sector. German garrisons, meant to be the backbone of coastal defense, were instead isolated islands of frightened men, too shocked to maneuver. By midday, the beaches at Utah and Omaha were firmly in Allied hands. German counterattacks that should have driven the invaders into the sea never arrived. The garrisons that might have resisted inland were reeling from the previous night's explosions and ambushes. The violence had not been overwhelming in numbers, but it had been overwhelming in effect. Explosives and ambushes had convinced German commanders that they faced a much larger force than actually existed. In reality, scattered groups of paratroopers, sometimes only 4 or 5 men, had achieved what entire divisions might not: the paralysis of enemy communications and movement. The stunned reactions of German soldiers captured in the following days reveal their bewilderment. Many admitted they had never faced opponents who fought this way. One corporal described it simply: "We did not fight a battle. We were hunted like animals in the night." The shock of being ambushed at every turn, the thunder of explosions echoing across the countryside, and the silence of dead communication lines left them unable to act. For German garrisons trained to expect set-piece warfare, the American airborne assault was unlike anything they had imagined. Their paralysis on June 6th was not a failure of courage, but the natural result of facing an enemy who attacked everywhere at once without warning. Dawn on June 6, 1944, revealed a battlefield transformed by airborne action. Bridges that German commanders had counted on as critical arteries for counterattacks were already in American hands. Yet capturing a bridge was only the first step. Holding it against determined enemy fire and preparing it for the influx of armor and supplies from the beaches demanded the unique skills of combat engineers. For the paratroopers, seizing a span over a river or canal was an act of bravery. For the engineers, securing that span under fire was a test of relentless precision carried out in the middle of chaos. Without their work, every tactical gain of the airborne troops would have been temporary, for bridges were not simply crossing points, they were lifelines that would determine whether the invasion advanced inland or bogged down at the water's edge. At the La Barquette Lock and Causeway, paratroopers of the 502nd had overrun German positions in a pre-dawn assault, taking control of a structure that regulated flooding across the low-lying countryside. The Germans had prepared charges intending to destroy the lock and inundate the fields, transforming them into an impassable swamp. When American engineers arrived, they found wires leading to demolition chambers already in place. German prisoners revealed that the charges had been armed but not detonated. Every minute mattered. Under intermittent rifle and machine gun fire from retreating defenders, the engineers crawled across the lock, cutting wires and flooding the demolition chambers with water. Sergeant James Charles of the 326th Engineer Battalion recalled, "It was like working on a bomb that might go off any second. We could hear bullets cracking past, but nobody wanted to be the one to stop. If that lock went, half the division would be isolated in a swamp." By 0600 hours, the charges were neutralized and the lock remained intact, securing one of the most vital crossings inland from Utah Beach. Further north, at the bridges over the Douve River near Carentan, the situation was even more precarious. German defenders had pulled back across the water, leaving charges wired to the spans. Paratroopers established tenuous control of the approaches, but sniper fire and mortar shells made it impossible to approach the structures openly. Engineers devised a plan. Using smoke grenades for concealment, small teams crept onto the bridges, lying flat as explosions erupted around them. With bayonets and wire cutters, they severed detonation cords, then plunged into the demolition chambers to rip out fuses by hand. Several were wounded in the process, but by mid-morning, the bridges were declared safe for traffic. When tanks of the 2nd Armored Division rolled forward days later, they crossed on spans saved by engineers who had worked nose-to-nose with German explosives while under direct fire. The challenge went beyond neutralizing demolitions. Once in American hands, bridges became magnets for German artillery. At the La Fière Causeway, connecting Sainte-Mère-Église to the western bank of the Meurthe River, paratroopers clung to defensive positions against repeated counterattacks. Engineers moved forward with them, carrying picks, shovels, and sandbags instead of rifles. Under constant mortar bombardment, they built hasty revetments to protect the road surface, filled craters blown by shells, and reinforced the bridge's abutments with whatever timber could be scavenged from nearby barns. Private Walter McDonald remembered, "Every time we filled one hole, another shell landed and blew it open again. But we knew tanks would need that causeway. If it washed out, the men on the far side were finished." For 3 days, engineers rotated in shifts, repairing under fire, while paratroopers held the line. Their combined defense turned La Fière into one of the most critical and fiercely contested crossings of the entire Normandy campaign. Securing bridges also meant improvising against continuous German efforts to destroy them indirectly. At Chef du Pont, German artillery observers directed fire onto the crossing with deadly accuracy. Engineers responded by constructing smoke generators along the approaches, burning everything from oil drums to damp straw to obscure the bridge from enemy gunners. The thick haze turned the area into a choking fog, but it saved lives. Trucks and jeeps could move across under partial concealment, and artillery fire shifted blindly, unable to adjust. The engineers paid heavily, many falling to shrapnel as they tended the smoke pots, yet the bridge remained functional. In the words of Captain Harold Stewart, It was the ugliest, dirtiest job of the whole operation, standing over a barrel of burning junk while shells fell all around. But it kept the enemy from seeing. That bridge survived because of smoke and stubbornness. Perhaps the most remarkable feat occurred when engineers converted damaged structures into viable crossings within hours. At one span over the Douve, retreating Germans had blown half the decking. Engineers arrived with planks and timbers dragged from nearby farms. Working under fire, they laid makeshift flooring strong enough to carry jeeps and light artillery. Photographs taken later show crude wooden planks nailed across shattered beams, a far cry from textbook construction, yet sufficient to keep supplies flowing. The improvisation astonished even seasoned officers. One paratrooper wrote, "We thought the bridge was gone for good. Then, the engineers came, and by sundown we were driving trucks across. It wasn't pretty, but it worked." The struggle to secure bridges was not limited to France. Similar scenes unfolded across every theater of the war where American airborne and infantry forces advanced. From Holland's canals during Operation Market Garden to the Rhine itself, engineers repeatedly placed themselves at the heart of the battlefield, fighting a war of endurance against explosives, artillery, and time. But in Normandy, their efforts carried special significance. Each bridge saved meant one less obstacle between the beachheads and the interior. Each causeway held meant German counterattacks were delayed or defeated. The survival of these crossings turned the airborne landings from raids into sustained footholds that could be reinforced and expanded. German commanders never expected American engineers to work with such speed and determination under fire. Their doctrine assumed that if a bridge was captured intact, demolitions would inevitably succeed in destroying it within hours. What they had not reckoned with was the willingness of engineers to crawl into demolition chambers with live charges still wired, or to rebuild shattered decking while shells burst overhead. For the defenders, the sight of engineers calmly repairing bridges that should have been obliterated was demoralizing. Reports from captured German officers reveal astonishment. One lieutenant wrote in his diary that, "Every time we thought a bridge was destroyed, within hours we saw American vehicles crossing again." It was as if they had an endless supply of bridges hidden somewhere. In truth, it was not hidden bridges, but relentless engineers, applying improvisation and courage in equal measure. By June 10th, the bridges and causeways secured by American airborne and engineer units had enabled armored divisions to pour inland. Columns of Sherman tanks, half-tracks, and supply trucks moved across structures that days earlier had been booby-trapped or cratered. The speed of reinforcement stunned the Germans, who had expected days of delay while engineers built new bridges under fire. Instead, the Allies advanced far faster than anticipated, their momentum driven by engineers who had refused to let rivers and canals become barriers. The role of these men, often overshadowed by dramatic airborne assaults, was in many ways the decisive factor that ensured the paratroopers' sacrifices were not in vain. The securing of bridges under fire stands as one of the most overlooked but critical elements of D-Day. Brave assault seized them, but it was methodical, dangerous, and often unheralded labor that kept them standing. Without that labor, airborne units would have been cut off, reinforcements delayed, and the invasion stalled. With it, the advance surged forward, overwhelming German defenses before they could regroup. The engineers' quiet heroism, performed in mud, smoke, and blood, ensured that the bridges of Normandy became gateways to liberation rather than tombs of failure. So when we speak of D-Day, we remember the courage of the paratroopers who fell from the night sky, the infantry who stormed the beaches, and the sailors who delivered them ashore. But we must also remember the engineers who, with wire cutters, shovels, and sheer determination, kept the captured bridges intact under relentless enemy fire. They turned fragile footholds into firm strongpoints and fleeting victories into lasting success. German commanders never expected such resilience, yet it was this resilience that allowed the Allied armies to break through, to roll inland, and eventually to crush the Reich itself. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the lesser-known but decisive battles within the D-Day invasion, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Check out our other videos on the hidden stories of World War II, from airborne raids to armored breakthroughs. And tell us in the comments, what do you think was the most critical factor on D-Day? The paratroopers' courage, the engineers' determination, or something else entirely?